Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me. If you can, you could just do me a favour and pop into the chat, yes, I can hear you, or yes, or morning, or whatever you want to put, just so I know that you are all here ready to go. We've got a couple of people that are still joining, so I'm going to waffle on a bit for a couple of minutes to give them a chance to join. And then we will get started and I'll hand over to Rohan. So before we do get going, thank you for joining another session. If you've been with us before, if this is your first session, welcome to ARU's HistoryFest. We're running sessions all week, so if you do particularly enjoy this one and want to come to some more, please do sign up for more, because we'd love to have you there. A couple of bits of housekeeping. Obviously, normally this would be on campus, so we don't have to worry about any fire drills or anything, so that's great. But we do want you to bear in mind that you won't need to have your camera on, so do keep that off, so we won't have to see you at all. You don't need to have your ability to speak either. You can just chat to us on the typed option, so keep yourselves muted. And if you do have any tech issues or anything like that, feel free to either privately message me in the chat and I'll try help you out, or drop me a quick email using the email that this link was sent to you. We haven't had that many issues. A couple of people with computer audio problems, but I've been able to help them with that. So anything like that, just let me know. Otherwise, most important thing is please enjoy the session. If you do have any questions or think of any questions, type them into the chat at any point during the chat and we will come and answer them at the end of the session. Other than that, enjoy, and I'll hand over to Rohan without further ado.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming along. I will apologise, by the way. I suddenly realised I think I've got some building works going on around the corner, so you may hear some noise. I'm sorry, there's not much I can do about that. But anyway, great. I'm going to be talking today about two vital presidencies, two figures who I think made not only the modern American presidency, but the modern United States. And their legacy in all sorts of ways can be felt today. I'm talking about John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who were presidents of the United States from 1961 through to 1969. Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, and he then became president on the assassination of Kennedy. These two figures shaped the politics of the 1960s. The 1960s, both in the United States and globally, was a time of huge turbulence. There were demands, for example, for civil rights for Black Americans. There were demands to end the exploitation of workers. There were attacks on imperialism. This was the time of the end of empires after the Second World War. It was a time of cultural change, a period of sexual liberation. There were new youth movements, whilst the Vietnam War proved to be the most divisive issue of the age. If you listened to my session about history at university yesterday, you may remember that when John F. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency in 1960, he was asked what was his greatest asset? And he immediately said his greatest asset was his sense of history. And Kennedy himself had written a number of historical works, so he did actually know what he was talking about. And he felt what would guide him as a president was his understanding of the historical forces that were at large in the world and how to react to them. And I think that's one of the best arguments for studying history. Now, I want to suggest to you that there are two contexts in which we should interpret these two figures. And if you're writing about them for A-level, this is what I would suggest, the way you should think about them. The first context, I think, would be the one suggested by the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Now, Schlesinger was one of the most important historians in the United States in the 20th century. He wrote a series of major books about President Andrew Jackson, about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he then became historian in residence during the Kennedy White House. And in fact, you can see a picture here of Schlesinger with John F. Kennedy in the White House. Schlesinger, in a very influential book called The Cycles of American History, you can see it there, Schlesinger argued that social reform in the United States was cyclical. It was based on, there were 30-year cycles of reform, and he said this characterized the 20th century. The first wave of reform began around 1900, and it was based around the progressive movement, which started to bring in reforms to deal with the problems of American capitalism and the huge poverty that existed in American cities. And progressivism dominated the first 20 years of the 20th century. But this was then followed by 10 years of conservatism during the 1920s. Okay, so progressivism exhausted itself. But then in 1932, there was a new cycle of progressive reform initiated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which shaped the 1930s as Roosevelt had to deal with the Great Depression and then the Second World War. So there's a wave of progressive reform, and then you've got a decade of conservative counter-reaction during the 1950s. When a lot of the reforms of the New Deal were to some extent put to one side. Then Schlesinger argued there was a new wave of reform, and it began in 1960, and it was embodied by the figures of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And that shaped to some extent, certainly the 1960s, to a certain extent the 1970s. And then there was a conservative counter-reaction in the 1980s with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Okay, so that's one context to think about the Kennedy administration, the beginning of a new cycle of social and political reform. The second context in which I think we should see the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies would be that they were examples of what I would call Cold War liberalism. Now this was, I think, an important dimension of American politics, which had its roots in the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who you can see there giving one of his talks on the radio. Now, Roosevelt developed an approach, especially during the Second World War, where he talked about 4 freedoms. And the idea was that American progressives need to fight for freedom and reform at home, and then stand up for freedom abroad. In other words, liberals had to confront fascism during the Second World War, and then communism after the Second World War, during the Cold War. And so Cold War liberals were people who were very much in favor of social reform at home, but were also determined to combat communism. Now, the big theory that sustained the Cold War was the idea of containment. The containment theory really sustained American foreign policy. It accepted that you couldn't get rid of communist countries, such as the Soviet Union or China, but you then had to stop communism spreading. So as the communist countries seem to have designs on other countries, the United States and its international allies had to be ready to contain them, to resist the spread of communism. So that's what containment was all about. And that shaped American foreign policy after the Second World War, and I would argue during the 1960s. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations were examples of this containment policy. They were also corporatist. They believed in getting trade unions and business and government together to make decisions. So they didn't simply rely on the free market. They wanted to bring in social reforms by bringing different social groups together. That's what I mean by corporatism. And that was an approach developed again by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the 1930s and was maintained in the 1960s. And this is why I would argue we should see the Kennedy and Johnson administrations as examples of the continuation of the New Deal political order. Now let's actually look at these two presidents. And of course, the luster and glamour of the Kennedy administration persists even today, 60 years after the administration. Quite simply, in 1960, Kennedy campaigned for the presidency and talked about, in an inspiring phrase, the new frontier of the 1960s. He seemed to express a new generation who was entering politics and who wanted to reshape America. So there was always a strong strand of idealism that ran through the Kennedy project. Kennedy, right up to today, is a figure who is shrouded in myth. And I suppose the great myth that, or story, which is not untrue, that surrounds Kennedy is that he came from a family of Irish Catholics in Boston who had been active in Boston politics since the end of the 19th century. And his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., who had been ambassador to Britain at the beginning of the Second World War, his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., wanted his son to become the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. Now, initially, Joseph Kennedy Sr. Wanted that figure to be his eldest son, Joe Jr. Okay, Joe Jr. was primed to become the figure who would go on to become president of the United States. But then Joe Jr. was killed on active service flying in the Second World War. And then that responsibility fell on the second eldest son, who was John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy himself, during the Second World War, became a war hero. And this is undoubtedly true. He actually saved the men on the boat he was in the Pacific during the war from being killed. He saved a lot of lives. Had quite a remarkable career in the Navy during the Second World War. And that also helped launch him in politics. I also think that Joe Jr., had he lived, would not have succeeded in politics, because he had made comments as the war began, which was sympathetic both to Hitler and which suggested that Britain would inevitably fail and be defeated in the Second World War. I think this would have destroyed him in politics. Whereas John F. Kennedy was much shrewder about the historical forces, and so he, I think, said the right things. But where John F. Kennedy was, I think, shaped by his father, was that Joseph Kennedy Sr. Gave his sons a kind of ruthlessness, a determination to succeed. The Kennedy boys, and they were a large family, of which I should say the last one, Gene Kennedy Smith, died a couple of days ago. But the Kennedy children were all brought up with the idea that being second is lousy. Okay, in any competition, you have to win. And so there was always that kind of ruthlessness that ran all the way through the Kennedys. And after the war, Joseph Kennedy Sr. used his money as a wealthy businessman. He used his money to, first of all, put John F. Kennedy into Congress, first in the House of Representatives, and then as senator for Boston. And even as a senator, people were very much aware of Kennedy because he seemed so glamorous. He was handsome. He had a beautiful wife, Jacqueline. If you look at Life magazine, which is one of the most popular magazines of the period, they were constantly covering the Kennedy family. People were absolutely fascinated by him. But he was relatively conservative as Democrats go. And one of the big criticisms that's often made of Kennedy is that during the 1950s, he did not speak out against Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare, the kind of people who are pursuing a communist witch hunt. In fact, Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, actually worked for Joe McCarthy at one point. So he was relatively conservative when he got the nomination for the Democratic nomination in 1960. And because he came from Massachusetts, from Boston and Massachusetts, he chose as a running mate a figure who came from the other side of the country. Okay, the idea was to get a balanced ticket geographically. So he chose Lyndon Johnson from Texas, with whom he didn't actually particularly get on, but he politically made sense, and they ran for the presidency. Now, the 1960 election was one of the defining elections in American history for all sorts of reasons, but one of them was the use of the media. It saw the first ever television debates, and here Nixon took on the Republican candidate, who was Richard Nixon. Now, during those debates, Kennedy came over as polished, sophisticated, and extremely handsome, whereas Nixon came over very badly. He was badly made up. He looked as though he was sweating under the lights, and he looked rather pallid compared to this extremely handsome man. Lyndon Johnson and his team listened to the debates on the radio, and this is, I think, important. They listened to the debates on the radio, and they thought that Nixon had won. And it was only when they then saw the debates on television that they saw it in a very different kind of way. The visual impact of Kennedy, I think, was extremely important. People felt that here was someone who represented a new generation. And that's one of the reasons why Kennedy won in 1960. But he barely won. The election was extremely narrow, but ultimately he did defeat Richard Nixon. And then in his inaugural address at the beginning of 1961, he very much inspired Americans with the kind of thinking that he was bringing to the White House, yet getting rid of the conservatism that had been associated with President Eisenhower. And if you're studying Kennedy, can I recommend you all watch the inaugural address? You'll find it on YouTube without any trouble at all. And the inaugural ended with these inspiring words, which really, I think, captured the Kennedy image. He ended his address by saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." In other words, he was calling Americans to an act of service to their country. So he came over as both idealistic and patriotic. And this really set the tone, I think, for the Kennedy presidency. Now let's actually think about Kennedy as a president. Now at home, he was very much associated with liberalism, with social reform. And most books, I think, would say that Kennedy on the home front was able to achieve relatively little. A couple of reasons for this. First of all, of course, the Kennedy administration didn't last all that long, basically 3 years. But Kennedy was also frustrated by conservative Democrats in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, particularly Democrats from the South, who were determined, for example, to not allow Kennedy to make any progress on the issue of civil rights, the civil rights movement as embodied by the figure of Martin Luther King, who you can see in the picture during the March on Washington. And what we now think as historians about modern American liberalism, going back to the New Deal of the 1930s, is it did reshape America in all sorts of ways, but it was based upon white supremacy. Roosevelt and then Kennedy later on were allowed to make reforms, and conservative Democrats in the South would support them as long as nothing was done about segregation in the South, nothing was done to really promote civil rights. Reformers were not even allowed to bring in a bill to abolish the lynching of black people. Okay, so there is an argument now that a lot of social reform was nevertheless based on white supremacy, or at least not doing anything about white supremacy in the American South. However, it should be said that as president, Kennedy always made clear that he was a supporter of racial justice. The only thing was, he believed change had to come in terms of race relations, in terms of civil rights for black Americans, but that pace of change had to be slow to allow white Americans to absorb it. The only problem was that the pace of the civil rights movement wouldn't allow for that. Black people, understandably, wanted change immediately, and that was the message pursued by figures like Martin Luther King, or people like the Freedom Riders, black Americans who got to the segregated transport system in the American South and sat in white-only parts of the bus and refused to move. Eventually, Kennedy was forced to send in federal marshals to actually support the Freedom Riders, who eventually prevailed. They managed to desegregate the public transport system in the South. And when Kennedy died, he was ready to present a civil rights bill to Congress. Now, many books, I think, will tell you that had Kennedy presented that bill, had he lived and presented that bill, it would have failed. And we don't know. We will never know what will happen because Kennedy died, and Lyndon Johnson, his successor, was able to use the martyrdom of Kennedy to get civil rights through. Okay, I personally tend to think that had Kennedy lived and had he presented a civil rights bill in late 1963 or early 1964, it would have gone through. Why do I think that? And of course, we don't know. This is one of those what-if questions. I just think that in 1963, civil rights was an issue whose time had come. A lot of white Americans recognized that something had to be done about this, that this couldn't be sort of pushed under the carpet any longer. And so I think that the political momentum for civil rights was there. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson was then able to exploit that. And I'll come back to civil rights in a moment. Elsewhere on the domestic front, Kennedy maintained the corporatism of the New Deal. He brought business and trade unions and government together to make a series of agreements to run the economy. Now, if you don't think that's very remarkable, remember that today the essential assumption in politics is we let the market do the work. We keep government out of the economy and just let the free market rip. Okay, so this is a rather different approach to how to run the economy from what we have today. He also wanted to stimulate the economy, and he went for a tax cut to get more people spending. and to lower unemployment. He also increased the minimum wage and actually managed to secure economic growth, though that growth was mainly felt after Kennedy's death. But this is why I would argue that it's not true to say that Kennedy achieved little. In fact, I think in his limited time, he actually did relatively well, I think, on domestic policy. His foreign policy, however, was much more remarkable, and this is where it's more obvious that he was a Cold War liberal, because he was determined to resist Soviet communism. And the flashpoint in American politics at that time was Cuba, which had been taken over by communists under Fidel Castro. On the day he entered the White House, Lyndon Johnson found a plan on his desk by the CIA to invade Cuba, working with rebels in Cuba against the Castro regime. And the idea was to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy immediately actioned the plan. The invasion went ahead, and it was a disaster. Castro repelled the invasion with ease, and it was a huge embarrassment for Kennedy. And even after that, his regime maintained a secret war against Castro in Cuba, which was called Operation Mongoose. And they came up with all sorts of plans to try and assassinate Castro. They even went into some sort of James Bond stuff. I mean, they sent him a box of cigars. And the idea was that once he tried to smoke one of these, it would explode and kill him. That didn't work. But things then got very bad in 1962 when we had the Cuban Missiles Crisis, when it was discovered that the Soviets had planted missiles in Cuba. And of course, if you know your geography, Cuba is not far away from the United States mainland. And so these rockets could easily hit the United States. Kennedy immediately said that he would, if these rockets were launched, he would retaliate not against Cuba, but against the Soviet Union. So this was the Cuban Missiles Crisis, and it could easily have led to the Third World War, a nuclear confrontation, which might have meant that, quite simply, we wouldn't be here. Eventually, the Russian Premier, Khrushchev, who you can see in the cartoon, Khrushchev eventually backed down. And he agreed to withdraw the weapons from Cuba, and in return, the United States promised that it would not try to invade Cuba. Okay, and in the wake of the Cuban Missiles Crisis, Kennedy then started to make overtures to try and achieve a lasting peace with the Soviet Union. The other aspect of Kennedy's foreign policy, which we ought to note at least, is that in many ways, Kennedy really helped begin the Vietnam War. Technically, the Vietnam War began under Lyndon Johnson, but Kennedy was determined to support the regime in South Vietnam, which feared incursion from North Vietnam, which was communist. And it also feared the supporters of North Vietnam in the South, in South Vietnam, who were called the Viet Cong. So increasingly, Kennedy sent in the Green Berets, soldiers who were technically meant to be advisors. But he built up the American military presence in South Vietnam. So to some extent, the Vietnam War started under Kennedy. And had Kennedy lived, I think he would almost certainly have got caught up in the quagmire of the Vietnam War, and we would see him in a very different way today. But it's also worth saying that the Cold War liberalism took other forms. For example, one of the enduring legacies of the Kennedy administration is that he launched the space program. And he made it a huge national effort that he wanted to put a man on the moon before 1970. And of course, in 1969, they achieved just that. And so here we can see John F. Kennedy inspecting a prototype space capsule. Okay, so that was one of the great long-term achievements of the Kennedy administration. But even this, although it expressed a lot of the idealism of the 1960s and its belief in science and technology making the world a better place, even this was an example of the Cold War. Kennedy feared the Soviet domination of outer space. After all, the Russians got a man into space first. So there was a Cold War dimension to the space program. The idealism of the Kennedy years was, I think, most obviously felt, though, in his creation of the Peace Corps. And this was a scheme whereby young Americans could go out and work in poor countries in the third world. They were able to take their skills out to the to other countries and work, on schemes to end famine, to help with education of poor people in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere. And many young Americans signed up for this. This was exactly what they associated with those sentiments. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Okay, so the Peace Corps was an example of American idealism, though again there was a kind of Cold War dimension to it. Some people see it as a way of actually spreading American imperialism. Certainly, it would be an example of what we call soft power, as opposed to hard power. Hard power is governments doing things against other countries, the Cuban Missiles Crisis, the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. That's hard power. The Peace Corps, though, would be an example of soft power. Now, what would have happened with the Kennedy administration, as I said, is a great what-if question, because, of course, he was assassinated on the 22nd of November, 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, then became president. And Lyndon Johnson won the presidential election of 1964, and he served in the White House till 1969. Now, Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat. He had dominated Texas politics in the 1940s and 1950s. He was one of the key figures in the American Senate. And he came from a poor background. And he was always really patronized by the Kennedys, who always thought he was rather uneducated. He was like the opposite of the kind of glamorous, sophisticated Kennedys. And they never really took him seriously. Indeed, he might well have been dumped for the ticket in 1964 if Kennedy had lived. But I'm going to argue that as president, Lyndon Johnson was far more effective than John F. Kennedy. He called his program for government the Great Society. And I think we can see this, first of all, as a continuation of the New Deal of the 1930s, but also, I would argue, as an example of Cold War liberalism. He, first of all, pushed through the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This is one reason why I think even Kennedy would have got that law through. But Johnson used the death of Kennedy to get leverage over conservative Southerners, and he got it through. This made it illegal to discriminate against black people, especially in areas of employment. And then he followed it up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this made it illegal to prevent black people from voting. Okay, so that's the basis of modern civil rights legislation. And just on that alone, I think that makes Johnson a pivotal figure in American history. Although he, as a Southerner, said, after he passed that legislation, we, the Democrats, have lost the South. And to a large extent, that was true. By and large, up to the early 1960s, the Republicans were strong in the North and the Democrats were strong in the South. The political map of the United States flip-flopped. Increasingly, it was the South that voted Republican and the North that voted Democrat. And that is still the case. It's still very difficult for Democrats to make headway in the American South, although at the moment they're doing very well in Virginia and possibly in Florida as well. So the politics of America changed. The political map of the United States changed. Increasingly, you had the Republicans dominating the American South as white people took flight from the Democrats because they objected to civil rights legislation being, as they saw it, foisted upon them. But Johnson's commitment to social reform, which I think was genuine, didn't stop there. He called for a war on poverty. And this involved, for example, community-based projects to assist the poor, going into poor areas to help with nutrition, with food stamps, to help with education, and to give poor people opportunities that they had never previously had. He then introduced Medicare, which actually involved the federal government paying for the health expenses of elderly Americans. Remember, the United States does not have a national health service the way we do. So this is the closest the United States has ever got to it. And then he matched Medicare for the elderly with Medicaid for the poor, allowing poor people to get access to health facilities, and meant they didn't have to pay for it. Okay, so that made a huge amount of difference. What's more, in 1965, he passed a law which opened up the United States to further immigration. During that period of conservatism in the 1920s I spoke about, there had been an act passed in 1924 which essentially limited immigration to people from Northern Europe. People from China and Asia were essentially banned. Even Italians for a while were banned. So it's essentially white people from Britain and Germany who were allowed to enter the United States. There's some exceptions to that, but this then was scrapped. And his immigration law allowed families of American citizens to enter without any kind of restrictions. And this started, for example, to build up a huge Latino population. It began, for the first time, we began to see an Asian population really developing, an Indian population, for example. The Chinese population of the United States began to expand. In other words, we begin to see the huge multi-ethnic makeup of the United States as we know it today expand. In the next 20 years, we will see the first Latino American president, I'm pretty sure. That will be one of the big events of your lifetimes. And the reason why that can happen is because of the reforms that Lyndon Johnson made in terms of immigration. So this is serious legislation that was transformative, that made a huge amount of difference. Okay, so why do people now not talk about Lyndon Johnson maybe as the last really great American president? Well, there's an answer to that: the Vietnam War. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Lyndon Johnson was sucked in to the conflict in Vietnam to defend South Vietnam against North Vietnam. The conflict escalated, and Lyndon Johnson was forced to pursue more and more troops into a war which never seemed to get anywhere. That seemed to be perpetual stalemate. The Viet Cong, the supporters of North Vietnam in the South, simply could not be defeated. The war had two major consequences at home. The first was that the Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson introduced could not be funded as adequately as they needed to be because money had to go to the Vietnam War. The second consequence was that things in Vietnam got so bad that in 1968, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for the presidency, which he was allowed to do under the Constitution. He could have run for another term, but he decided not to do so because he wanted to concentrate on trying to win the Vietnam War, which he was unable to do. And in 1968, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, who of course had stood against Kennedy in 1960, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, won. And he won on a ticket promising to end the Vietnam War, which in fact went on and on and on and didn't end, as you can see, until 1975. So let's take our two figures, Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. Who achieved more? Well, undoubtedly, Kennedy is better known today. I'm sure even before you studied him, many of you were aware of the Kennedy presidency. But I have argued this morning that it was Lyndon Johnson who made the most difference. It was Lyndon Johnson who shaped government in America as we know it today. It was Lyndon Johnson who helped create something like an American welfare state. I mean, the roots of American Social Security go back to the 1930s, to the New Deal. But the modern American state, welfare state with Medicare and Medicaid, that is the work of Lyndon Johnson. It was Lyndon Johnson who really helped create the United States as that multi-ethnic society that we know today. And yet what united these two figures is that they were examples of Cold War liberalism. They believed in containing communism, or as they would have put it, standing up for freedom abroad, whether in terms of the Cuban Missiles Crisis or in terms of the Vietnam War. But they also believed in freedom at home, in social reform to enhance the lives of ordinary Americans. And that's the difference that I think politics made in the 1960s. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rohan. Now, I can imagine quite a lot of people have got lots of questions. I know that I've got one that I'd like to ask, but I won't ask mine yet, just in case there are others that want to ask questions. So if you would like to ask a question, if you could just type it into the chat for us, and I will read those out to Rohan, and I'm sure he'll be able to happily answer them for us. If you guys don't have one or you're thinking of one at the minute, I will ask mine in a second. It's not the one you think, Rohan, don't worry. I'll tell you what, I'll ask mine so that people can... Oh, no, there we go. We've got one here. What are your thoughts on the legitimacy of the findings of the Warren Commission?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, in fact, actually, this is the who shot Kennedy question. Actually, I actually talk about the legitimacy of the Warren Commission, which, for people who don't know, is the commission that was introduced by Lyndon Johnson to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and essentially that came to argue that the assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, and ultimately that he was acting alone. What do I think about the legitimacy of it? I think actually, by and large, the findings of the Warren Commission have actually stood up. I know there are lots of conspiracy theories. There are lots of people who think that Kennedy was murdered by the mafia. There were people who feel that he was murdered on the orders of Castro, following the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missiles Crisis. And it is true that Lee Harvey Oswald had links with the Soviet Union. That's undoubtedly true. But as far as we can tell, based on the actual evidence that we have, Lee Harvey Oswald was a disturbed individual and a crank, and ultimately it was he who killed John F. Kennedy, by and large, on his own. It was his own decision. He was not being manipulated by other people. He decided to do it. I think that's still the best bet. I think when Robert Kennedy died, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, I think Robert Kennedy, who had access to all the evidence, believed the Warren Commission, that actually ultimately that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and I know I've heard people who worked with Robert Kennedy who said that ultimately he believed it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Perfect, thank you, Rohan. Got another question now from Lucy. She says, "Thank you, very interesting lecture. Were the positive effects of Johnson's reforms recognised and felt at the time? Today, in the public recollection, Johnson's achievements are overshadowed by the Vietnam War, but was this also the case during his time in power?"
Now, first of all, thank you. That's a really good question, Lucy. Actually, not a straightforward one to answer, actually, but I think it. I'm going to answer it by saying I think it was recognised. I think Johnson's achievements were recognised. And here we're going to go into another what-if question. What would have happened if Johnson had actually run for the presidency in 1968? I sense that he probably would have won. For all sorts of reasons, but one of them would be that I think a lot of people recognise that the Great Society had made a lot of difference, and indeed Richard Nixon didn't unpick the Great Society. Okay, so these were reforms that weren't then scrapped by Richard Nixon, who bizarrely was actually quite liberal actually on the home front. He was conservative on all sorts of other things, but he was actually quite liberal on a lot of these things. He didn't scrap Medicare and Medicaid. A lot of those things then continued. So I think it was recognised at the time. But, and if you talk to anyone of that period, they still resent Lyndon Johnson. Because the Vietnam War was seen as having been a mistake. It was an unwinnable war, and it actually damaged America at home. As I said, it meant that a lot of those Great Society programs, which were very worthy in themselves, they weren't being properly funded because huge amounts of resources and money and manpower had to go into the Vietnam War. So he remained a controversial figure. That's why I think he ultimately declined to run in 1968. But I still sense that had he actually run, he was a brilliant politician, had he run, he would have won. But so thank you, Lucy. Great question.
Thank you, Rohan. Another question now from Ava. How do you think Kennedy's Catholic Irish-American background influenced his civil rights campaign, for example?
That's right. Another really good question. And what I would say to people is that the idea of a Catholic president, or the United States having a Catholic president, might not strike you as particularly shocking or all that terrible. It was extremely controversial in 1960 because Catholics, whether Italian Catholics or in this case Irish Catholics, always felt they were excluded from American power and politics. That government and politics was meant to really for what we call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In other words, Protestants and not Catholics. In 1928, the Democrats had actually run an Irish Catholic for the presidency, Al Smith, and he was defeated in a campaign which saw some really vicious anti-Catholicism. And even in 1960, when he was running for the presidency, Kennedy had to make clear that as president, he would make his own decisions. He would not be guided by the Pope. Okay, so in one sense he had to slightly distance himself from his Catholicism, although the Catholicism of the Kennedys was fairly sincere. Kennedy himself wasn't the most devout of Catholics. Robert Kennedy was a devout Catholic. He would go to Mass, for example, every Sunday, and he would make his children say their prayers and things like that. But I think there was a certain sense in which Kennedy was also aware of a Catholic tradition of thought which dates back to the 19th century, which emphasizes the common good, which is actually about saying that if you're going to create God's kingdom on earth, then what you've got to care about, not just everybody making lots of money, but there is a sense of the common good, of common welfare, and that government has to strive for that common good. That's always at the back of a strand of Roman Catholic thinking. It's not, they don't have a monopoly on thinking like that, by the way, but so I think if you're going to ask me, to directly answer your question, you said, well, what difference did it make? I think it actually made quite a lot of difference the way he thought about social issues, and that's why there was that kind of commitment to social reform. It's why both John F. Kennedy and then later Robert Kennedy had a strong awareness of poor people in America who had been essentially shut out of the entire political system, and they recognized that something had to be done about this. So in all sorts of ways, I think the Catholicism made a difference. Kennedy managed to win in spite of being a Catholic, I think, but it also, I think, influenced some of his social thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. Now, one thing I always consider when looking into the past is how these people would fare in today's world. And I just wanted to ask you how you think Kennedy, bearing in mind his visual appearance was obviously quite appealing to the electorate, with the prevalence of social media today and thinking about the current issues with regards to Black Lives Matter, how do you think he would fare as a president today?
Oh, I think it'd be okay. Well, we would now have endless Kennedy tweets. I think if he was president today. I think Kennedy is often seen as having been one of the first presidents to really master the media, the mass media. Actually, that's not quite true, actually. I think, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I showed you all the photograph of Roosevelt on the radio. He, in the 1930s, he really mastered the art of radio. That was the great form of communication. Kennedy, however, mastered the art of television. He realized that if you're going to succeed in politics, you had to be good on television. And I think, so he's very much aware of new technology. Now, of course, it's not just television. It is, as Rob says, it is social media. To succeed in politics, in Britain, America, anywhere else, you've got to be mastering the digital universe. You've got to be on Facebook. You've got to be tweeting. We have endless tweets from Donald Trump and Instagram, Snapchat. That's where a lot of politics is happening. One of the things we're aware of, for example, now in the 29 election that we've just had in Britain, was that one of the reasons why the Conservatives won is clearly they won the digital war. In a way that Labour didn't. Well, and I think Kennedy would have been taking the Kennedy brand, and he would have put it on Facebook, he would have been putting it on Twitter, his supporters would have been promoting it. So I think, if people are surprised, say, by Donald Trump's tweets, it was daily tweets today, it really goes back to the kind of thing of which Kennedy was a master, really, in the 1960s.
Well, thank you, Rohan. Got another question now from Ava. What do you think about the modern Kennedys and how JFK has influenced their power today? I'm not sure, but I think his daughter ran for a position in the Democrats during one of Obama's presidencies and lost, but was still given an ambassador post.
And indeed, in fact, the last Kennedy sibling, Jean Kennedy Smith, who died 2 days ago, of course, was ambassador to Ireland during in the 1990s, and was key to the peace process in Northern Ireland afterwards. And in fact, the Kennedys, of course, retained a strong commitment to Ireland, from which they had originated in the 19th century. So, so Irish politics remained important to them. Of course, the only thing about the subsequent generation of Kennedys is, well, many of them died. John Jr. died. And I think that where we're seeing new Kennedy activity is the children and grandchildren of Robert Kennedy. They're the people who are now kind of making the running. What was interesting about the Kennedys, really from the 1950s onwards, the Kennedys became America's equivalent of the royal family. And of course, the United States don't have a royal family, but they have the Kennedys. That's why they followed all the activities of the Kennedys. The Kennedys are always great celebrities, but they that was, I mean, began to change a little bit. There's a rival royal family in the United States, which is now the Bush family. I think both the elder President Bush, the younger President Bush, and they're now a younger generation of Bushes who are coming along. I think they're shaping American politics. And now, of course, we've got the Trump family. Not only at some point we will possibly have Ivanka Trump running for the Republican nomination. And people are alarmed, I think, that curiously, in the land of the free, American politics still seems to be dominated by a relatively small number of families, if only because they have name recognition. So it matters if you're called Kennedy, if you're called Bush, or you're called Trump. And I suspect probably it may come to that it matters also if you're called Clinton as well. We've had Bill Clinton run as president, Hillary Clinton run for the presidency. I won't entirely be surprised if in another decade or so we get Chelsea Clinton versus George P. Bush, who's the son of Jeb Bush. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that conflict. I think many people wish that the Democrats today were running not Joe Biden, but Michelle Obama. So politics in the United States is dynastic. It's based on a remarkably small number of people. And it's very difficult, if you're not part of those sort of dynastic families, to really get a look in. I mean, Barack Obama did manage to do that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rohan. So thinking about the Kennedys more recently, we're going to go further back now. And Sharif has asked, first, she said, thank you for the lecture. It's been really informative. But she understands that JFK's father was partly blamed for Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies. And I was just wondering how this might have affected JFK's run for presidency and, of course, the perception of the Kennedy family before JFK's presidency.
Yeah, well, this is thank you. That's a very, very good question. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was always controversial for a number of reasons. First of all, in the 1920s, he was a wealthy businessman. He built up a huge real estate portfolio. That's not what was controversial. What's controversial? He also made money from bootlegging. In other words, selling illegal alcohol. He also had all sorts of other sinister business dealings. But he made his way up through the Democratic Party. He became Roosevelt's ambassador to Britain just before the Second World War and as the war started. And of course, as you said, he certainly supported appeasement and Neville Chamberlain. He had supported the Munich Agreement. He also believed that if there was a war, he believed Britain would crumble. And that wouldn't be a problem, except he said this very publicly. And to the extent that Winston Churchill eventually, as Prime Minister, wanted to get rid of him, and eventually he was withdrawn. Now, many of those statements, I think, should have damaged the Kennedys, and they would have damaged Joseph Kennedy Jr., who agreed with his father. But first of all, but John F. Kennedy had never gone along with that. He actually read a book called Why England Slept. He was actually a critic of appeasement, so he wasn't tainted by the pro-appeasement policies of his father. So that made a difference. The other thing that I think made a difference, and why this was not held against him, was that John F. Kennedy then became a war hero. Okay, he had undoubtedly served with some distinction And then when he was running in 1946 for Congress, and when people in Boston said to him, "How can you represent a poor district because you live in a nice mansion in Boston?" His reply was, "Well, when I went on the boat PT 109 in the Pacific, and had to save all those men, nobody asked my address then. They just wanted to know, am I prepared to serve?" And then he said, when my brother was shot down in an airplane over Europe on active service, fighting for his country, nobody asked him for his address then. So that kind of, the war service, I think, really eclipsed the pro-appeasement policies of their father. They got rid of the embarrassment of Joseph Kennedy Sr. And indeed, Joseph Kennedy Sr. himself acknowledged that the positions he had taken would have destroyed his own political career. That's why his ambitions then transferred onto his sons. As I said, first Joe Jr. and then John F. Kennedy.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rohan. Now, I'm very aware of the time. I honestly think we could probably spend all day asking you questions and finding out the answers. So thank you for answering those. But I will bring the session to a close now. And I just want to say a massive thank you to Rohan for leading that session. That was really informative and really enjoyable to listen to. Thank you to everyone that's attended. It's been a pleasure to have you here. And as I said at the start, if you're signed up to any of our other sessions later in the week, we look forward to seeing you again. If you would like to sign up to more, you can go on back onto the Eventbrite and register for some more sessions later on in the week. But other than that, I'll end the meeting for you, and you can all have a lovely day. Thank you very much. They're all passing on their thanks to you, Rohan, in the chat. So
and thank you all for coming, and thank you for those wonderful questions. Those are really good, actually. They're really sharp questions. I really enjoyed them. Thank you very much. Okay, cheers all.
No worries. Thank you all. Have a lovely day.